Ever watched a room full of powerful people run a script they think can't be interrupted until the person they underestimated flips the whole system on them? Hold on, because this night in a glittering ballroom starts with humiliation and ends with an audit trail that no amount of money can erase. Kneel down. Victoria Sterling's voice cracked across the Metropolitan Ballroom like a whip, sharp enough to slice through violins, laughter, and the hum of money talking to itself. 300 pairs of wealthy eyes turned in synchronized curiosity toward the stage where the city's most untouchable woman stood, index finger extended, pointing directly at Ruby Washington. Ruby stood in the wreckage of shattered champagne flutes, golden bubbles soaking into marble, her black server uniform spattered, and her grandmother's old watch steady on her wrist, ticking like a metronome that didn't care who was rich and who was not. Victoria glided a step closer, the way certain people move when they're used to gravity bending for them, and her voice dropped into that cold, polished tone you hear from someone who has never once paid a price for cruelty. I said, kneel down and apologize for your clumsiness. The silence tightened until you could feel it in your teeth. The crowd wasn't just watching, they were waiting for the expected output. They'd watched 1,000 times before the black waitress, humbled, the queen satisfied, the machine of hierarchy running right on schedule. Victoria's red lips curled into a smile that promised she was about to collect another little trophy of obedience. But Ruby didn't bow. She didn't flinch. She didn't even look surprised. She slowly raised her head and a small, calm smile spread across her face. The kind of smile engineers get when a test finally hits the exact breakpoint they've been waiting for. In Ruby's mind, her grandmother's voice rose like a steady signal through noise. Right timing. Ruby, everything has its right timing. Today, that moment had arrived. Here, the Metropolitan Hotel's grand ballroom had been in full gala mode, buzzing like a data center at peak load. The city's elite drifted across the polished floors under chandeliers that cost more than some neighborhood moving in clusters like predators in their natural habitat. Tech moguls, real estate dynasties, pharmaceutical heirs, oil barons, people who talked about impact the way other folks talk about weather. Their conversations were full of charitable buzzwords and polished pity, as if poverty existed only as a distant variable they could solve with a check and a photo op. Ruby moved among them, almost invisible, as service staff are trained to be. She was 28, natural hair tucked into a neat bun, black uniform pressed crisp, hands steady as she balanced crystal on silver trays. She had the kind of quiet dignity that makes some people look twice. But tonight most didn't look at all. She refilled glasses while listening to these donors debate which communities deserved help and which ones needed tough love, as if human worth was a metric you could model on a spreadsheet with no assumptions baked in. She heard women in couture describe homeless families with casual detachment, men in tailored suits talk about incentivizing responsibility, and everyone nod along as if they were adjusting knobs on a system they'd never actually monitored up close. At the center of the room, Victoria Sterling ruled like a monarch in a high-tech ecosystem that she owned outright. At 45, she was a master of elegant intimidation, wrapped in a midnight blue Chanel gown that flowed around her like liquid authority. Diamonds on her throat glittered like status LEDs, each one a tiny signal that she lived in a different economic universe. When Victoria spoke, she did it in measured, ringing tones that were designed to travel and to instruct. Charity isn't about enabling laziness, she announced to her circle of admirers, perfectly manicured hand, gesturing dismissively. Those who've proven their worth. The people around her nodded like a row of synchronized actuators. Ruby stood there refilling their flutes, hearing her own life reduced to a moral lecture by someone who knew nothing about her inputs, constraints, or load-bearing moments. But Ruby wasn't just a waitress. She had been a consultant once, a strategist, a woman who had walked into boardrooms and made CEOs listen with nothing but facts and clarity. She watched Victoria through that lens now, noticing what most of the room didn't. Victoria wasn't merely strict, she was hunting. She tracked servers with her eyes like she was looking for small chances to assert dominance. Ruby watched the way Victoria snapped at Marcus Chen, the head chef, because an appetizer arrangement didn't match her aesthetic. She saw Victoria's lips curl when an older server struggled with a heavy tray. This wasn't about standards. This was about power for the sake of power, and Victoria wielded it like a blade. Then Victoria's gaze landed on Ruby. "You there," she called, voice slicing through ambient chatter. Ruby turned, already knowing in her gut she'd been chosen. "Yes, you with the watch. Come here." Ruby approached carefully, each step controlled, hearing her grandmother again. "Keep your head high, child. Dignity can't be taken, only surrendered." Victoria scanned Ruby with the cold calculation of someone appraising tools they don't respect. "You're moving too slowly," she said, making sure her voice carried to nearby tables. "His guests deserve better service than what you're providing. I expect excellence from everyone at my events. Do you understand?" Ruby nodded politely. "Yes, ma'am, I'll do better." Something about Ruby's tone, too educated, too steady, too unbroken, sparked irritation in Victoria's eyes. Victoria stepped closer, perfume expensive enough to feel suffocating. Champagne spilled like liquid gold, and heads turned with the eager hunger of people who like watching a hierarchy reaffirm itself. She stood in the center of it, uniform splashed, face composed. Victoria pivoted into performance mode, voice dripping faux concern. "How clumsy. This is exactly what I meant. Some people simply aren't suited for positions requiring grace and competence." People murmured agreement, that peculiar satisfaction that comes from witnessing someone else's humiliation while your own status stays safe. Ruby knelt to gather shards, calm hands picking up crystal as if she were cleaning a lab spill, not being publicly baited. "I'm terribly sorry," she said, voice even. "I'll clean this up immediately." But Victoria needed more. She wanted full submission, the kind of spectacle that fed whatever engine drove her cruelty. "Sorry isn't sufficient," Victoria announced louder, ensuring maximum audience engagement. "You've ruined expensive crystal and disturbed my guest's evening. I should have you removed." Ruby kept cleaning, refusing to let her spine bend. Then she saw it, a small silver USB drive lying among the shards, likely dislodged from Victoria's purse during the collision. Ruby palmed it smoothly, the movement invisible because invisibility was the job she'd been forced into. The drive felt like a sudden dropped key in a locked system. Victoria barked orders at Marcus, emphasizing this person, in a way that made Ruby's jaw tighten, then dismissed her like a finished prop. Ruby stood slowly, met Victoria's eyes. "It won't happen again, Mrs. Sterling." Victoria smiled, certain she'd broken her. Ruby walked to the service corridor with quiet dignity, the USB drive pressing against her palm like a live circuit. The watch on her wrist ticked steadily, marking time until the right moment for truth. Downstairs in the staff break room, lit by humming fluorescents and old coffee, Ruby set the drive on the scratch table like a component waiting to be tested. Her hands trembled, not from fear but from adrenaline. 3 years. 3 years of careful positioning, swallowed pride, and invisible labor. Now opportunity had literally fallen into reach. She looked at herself in the cracked mirror and saw not a waitress, but Ruby Denise Washington, Harvard MBA, class of 2018, summa cum laude, former senior consultant at Morrison Strategic Group who used to make 6 figures analyzing corporate risk and restructuring. Her previous life ended 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days earlier. A date burned into her memory because it was the day she learned what happens when you challenge the wrong kind of power. Ruby had been leading due diligence on Sterling Industries' acquisition of Green Tech Solutions. The numbers didn't add up. Environmental reports falsified, safety violations buried, charitable tax shelters structured to skim money into personal enrichment. Ruby reported the irregularities, believing in institutional integrity, naive but honest. 48 hours later, her reputation was destroyed. Partners she trusted presented evidence of her misconduct. Her name vanished from credits. Hiring managers stopped calling. Her MBA became a paper shield in a war nobody warned her about. Victoria Sterling's influence didn't just fire Ruby, it erased her. Ruby plugged the USB into her phone with an adapter she kept for catering transfers. Folders bloomed across the screen, organized with a clean personal logic Ruby recognized instantly. Dates, codes, private backups. This was not foundation accounting. This was Victoria's real ledger. Ruby opened the first spreadsheet and her stomach went cold. $20 million. The number appeared again and again in tables comparing public donations to actual disbursements. Ruby's consultant brain zipped through patterns like it was back in a war room. This was systemic, not accidental. Marcus Chen's voice broke her concentration. "Working late again." He stood in the doorway with 2 cups of green tea, concern etched into the lines of his face. Marcus was 55, a man whose life had been derailed by the 2008 crash when engineering studies ended abruptly and survival took over. He'd climbed hospitality the hard way, and he'd become Ruby's closest ally at the Metropolitan because he'd sensed there was more to her than her uniform. Ruby closed the phone smoothly. Just reviewing tomorrow's schedule. Marcus didn't buy it, but he didn't push. Ruby, I've watched you 8 months. You handle pressure like someone who's been in boardrooms. You didn't break tonight. Victoria destroys people for sport. Be careful. Ruby nodded. Marcus didn't know about Jasmine, Ruby's younger sister, whose experimental lupus treatment could save her life, but cost $300,000. He didn't know Ruby had been counting server wages against a medical clock. I appreciate you, Ruby said quietly, but some fights choose you. Marcus shook his head. Just don't let revenge become another prison. Ruby paused at the door, USB warm in her pocket. Sometimes accountability and revenge look the same from the outside, she said. The difference is who's finally telling the story. The next morning, Ruby didn't wake up as prey. She woke up as a strategist. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Staff meeting at 10. Victoria wants to review service standards after last night. Ruby smiled once, thin and calm. Victoria thought she was about to tighten control. What she didn't know was that Ruby had already sent anonymous tips from a library computer to Sarah Mitchell at the Herald Tribune and civil rights attorney David Rodriguez, nudging the right investigators toward the right anomalies without exposing her hand too early. In that meeting, Victoria paced like a general, praising the gala's $2. $7 million haul, then pivoting to service failures, her eyes lingering on Ruby with remembered pleasure. Ruby held her gaze without flinching. Afterward, Ruby intersected Victoria in the corridor, polite as a scalpel. Mrs. Sterling, I wanted to apologize again. Your standards really resonated with me. Victoria's smile was predatory. Standards matter. Ruby tilted her head, innocent on the surface. I've been thinking about how the foundation determines worthiness. Transparency seems so important, especially with nonprofits under scrutiny these days. Victoria's face tightened so fast, Ruby almost laughed. We undergo rigorous audits. Complete transparency, she said, rehearsed. Ruby nodded brightly. Donors must love knowing their money goes exactly where it's supposed to. Victoria walked away quickly, fingers drifting to her purse in a reflexive check for a drive that wasn't there. By lunchtime, Ruby was summoned to the manager's office. The termination script was already loaded. Complaints about attitude, insubordination, theft, inappropriate comments, vague enough to brand her, sharp enough to fire her. Ruby, I'm sorry, the manager said, uncomfortable. We have to let you go effective immediately. Ruby packed her locker calmly while security waited. Marcus found her, furious. She did this because she's scared, he hissed. Ruby checked her grandmother's watch one last time in that hallway. Truth makes the powerful sweat, she said softly. Watch the news. She walked out through the lobby with her head high. The next day, another article, this time with documents. Donors started calling. Board members panicked. Federal investigators requested meetings. Victoria staggered into emergency mode, holding press conferences, denying everything, leaning on her reputation like a failing pillar. Then Sarah Mitchell asked on live camera, Are you familiar with Ruby Washington, who claims to have evidence of your improprieties? Victoria went pale. I don't know that individual, she lied. And right then, Ruby stepped into view, not in a server uniform, but in a tailored navy suit, hair professionally styled, posture like she owned the room because competence does that. Mrs. Sterling, Ruby said, voice clear as a bell. I'm Ruby Washington, Harvard MBA. You remember me from Morrison's Strategic Group, where I uncovered irregularities in your green tech acquisition right before you had my career erased. I'm also the waitress you had fired last week for asking about transparency. I have evidence of systematic fraud, money laundering, and charitable embezzlement, and I'm delivering it to federal investigators. The cameras detonated in flashes. The room erupted. Victoria's talking points disintegrated like brittle plastic under heat. 3 weeks later, the same ballroom hosted a public tribunal. Victoria entered flanked by lawyers who looked less confident by the minute. Ruby sat with David Rodriguez beside boxes of evidence in a calm that came from knowing the math. She testified methodically public reports versus real transfers, the human costs under every stolen dollar. When Victoria's team tried to discredit her, David pointed out the retaliation timeline. Ruby laid down bank logs, recorded calls, tax filings, offshore routing diagrams. The final blow was a recording of Victoria plotting to destroy evidence and coordinate false testimony. When that voice echoed through the ballroom, something inside the crowd shifted from shock to certainty. The panel deliberated briefly and returned with the inevitable finding: credible proof of fraud, laundering, and evasion under Victoria's direct control. Federal agents moved in front of the same kind of audience that once watched her humiliate others. Victoria's knees buckled. She sank to the floor, whispering apologies, too late to matter. Ruby looked at her grandmother's watch as the handcuffs closed. Tick. Tick. Right timing indeed. 3 months later, Ruby stood on that stage again, but the air in the room was different, lighter, honest, awake. Victoria was in federal custody serving a 15-year sentence and paying restitution that dismantled her fortune. Ruby now led a new foundation built on transparent design, real-time public reporting, dual authorization spending, quarterly surprise audits, board disclosure requirements. Marcus had left the Metropolitan to run operations beside her. And Jasmine sat in the front row, treatment funded, health returning. Ruby adjusted the mic with steady hands and said what mattered most. This city watched a foundation betray trust. Today we rebuild that trust with systems that can't be hijacked by ego or greed. Every dollar will be traceable, every outcome measurable. Charity isn't a stage, it's a responsibility. The room stood not for spectacle, but for the rare sight of accountability actually working. And if you take one thing from this story, let it be the engineering truth buried inside it. Power without oversight fails eventually, and the quiet people you ignore are often the ones who understand the system well enough to fix it or bring it down.